Power trips usually end when reality hits. But for two arrogant patrolmen, reality was about to hit like a freight train. Flashing police lights in a rear-view mirror shouldn't be a weapon of prejudice, yet these officers thought they were putting a nobody in her place. They dragged a black woman out of her car, mocked her clothes, and locked her in a freezing holding cell just for driving through their wealthy suburb. As they laughed and bragged, they were entirely unaware that the quiet woman sitting in their handcuffs held their badges, their pensions, and their impending federal prison sentences right in the palm of her hand. The highway stretching into Oak Haven was lined with ancient, weeping willows and manicured hedges that screamed old money and closed doors. Sarah Jenkins kept her eyes on the road, her hands loosely gripping the steering wheel of her dusty 2016 Ford Explorer. She wore a faded grey UCLA hoodie, comfortable yoga pants, and a worn-out pair of running shoes. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, the casual armor of a woman who had spent the last 14 hours driving across 3 state lines. Sarah was 48, a decorated former captain from the Chicago Police Department's gang task force, and a woman who had spent her entire life breaking through concrete ceilings. She had been headhunted by Oak Haven's desperate mayor, Richard Sterling, to root out the deep-seated corruption and racial profiling that had recently cost the city millions in civil rights lawsuits. She was slated to be sworn in as the new chief of police on Monday morning. Today was only Thursday. She had arrived early, hoping to quietly unpack her moving boxes at her new rental property, grab a slice of local pizza, and sleep for a solid 2 days. Oak Haven was exactly as the mayor had described it, picturesque on the surface, but possessing an undercurrent of hostility for anyone who didn't fit its specific demographic profile. As she crossed the city limits, her rearview mirror suddenly flared to life with the blinding strobe of police lights. Sarah glanced at her speedometer. She was doing 33 in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. Her tags were up to date. Her turn signals worked. She hadn't swerved. A calm, familiar, analytical coldness washed over her. She pulled the Explorer smoothly onto the shoulder, turned off the engine, rolled down her window, and placed both hands flat on the top of the steering wheel at 10 and 2. It was a practiced motion, a survival mechanism she knew all too well, even with a quarter-century of law enforcement experience under her belt. In her side mirror, she watched the driver's side door of the cruiser pop open. Officer Greg Holloway stepped out. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a tight buzz cut and a swagger that suggested he owned the pavement he walked on. His partner, Officer Todd Mitchell, a younger man with nervous eyes but an eager-to-please posture, emerged from the passenger side, lingering near the rear of her SUV with his hand resting casually on his duty weapon. Holloway took his time approaching her window. He didn't unclip his flashlight. The midday sun was bright enough. He leaned down, resting his forearm on her doorframe, invading her personal space immediately. His eyes swept over her faded hoodie, the disorganized cardboard boxes stuffed into the back seat. And finally, her face. The sneer that formed on his lips was subtle, but unmistakable. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Holloway demanded. No good afternoon, no ma'am, no explanation for the stop. Good afternoon, officer, Sarah replied, her voice even, devoid of the panic he was clearly expecting. May I ask why I was pulled over? Holloway's jaw tightened. He didn't like the pushback, however polite it was. I don't need to explain myself to you yet. I asked for your paperwork, unless there's a reason you don't want to hand it over. Sarah maintained eye contact. My wallet is in my purse, which shifted to the passenger side floorboard when I stopped. I'm going to reach over and get it now. Move slow, Holloway barked, his hand instinctively dropping to his belt. Sarah reached over, her movements deliberate and telegraphed. She retrieved her wallet, pulled out her Illinois driver's license, and handed it to him. My registration is in the glove box. May I open it? Holloway snatched the license from her fingers. He stared at it, then back at her. Sarah Jenkins, long way from Chicago. Sarah, what brings you to Oakhaven? This isn't exactly your kind of neighborhood. The phrasing was intentional. Your kind of neighborhood. I'm relocating for work, Sarah said simply. Work, Holloway repeated, a mocking lilt in his voice. He glanced back at Mitchell and chuckled. What kind of work, cleaning houses? Because you look like you're carrying your whole life in the back of this truck. You sure this vehicle belongs to you? My name is on the registration in the glove box, Sarah said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, taking on the commanding tone she usually reserved for briefing rooms. If you let me get it, you can verify that yourself. Holloway didn't like her tone. He didn't like that she wasn't shrinking under his gaze. Step out of the car, he ordered abruptly. Sarah blinked. Excuse me, on what grounds? I said step out of the damn car, Holloway shouted, suddenly ripping the driver's side door open. You are acting suspiciously. Your story doesn't add up, and I have probable cause to believe this vehicle might be stolen given the influx of vehicle thefts from out of state. It was a textbook escalation, a manufactured probable cause built entirely on prejudice and a bruised ego. Sarah knew the law backward and forward. She knew she could fight him right there on the shoulder of Route 114. She could announce who she was. She could scream for a supervisor. But as she looked into Holloway's aggressive eyes, a different thought crossed her mind. Mayor Sterling had hired her to find the rot in the Oakhaven Police Department. He had told her that the civilian complaints of harassment and racial profiling were stacking up, but the Internal Affairs Division always found the officers acted within department policy. Sarah realized she was being handed a golden opportunity, a completely unvarnished, authentic look at how her officers treated marginalized citizens when they thought nobody of consequence was watching. All right, Sarah said softly. I'm stepping out. The moment Sarah's running shoes hit the asphalt, Holloway grabbed her left arm and violently spun her around, slamming her chest against the side of her own vehicle. The hot metal of the SUV burned through the thin fabric of her hoodie. Hey, what are you doing? She gasped, genuinely shocked by the immediate escalation to physical force. Stop resisting, Mitchell yelled from behind, rushing forward to grab her right arm. I am not resisting, Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain loud, clear, and perfectly steady. My hands are flat against the vehicle. I am complying with all commands. Spread your legs, Holloway ordered, kicking her left ankle hard enough to make her stumble. He aggressively patted her down, his hands rough and deliberately humiliating as they swept over her pockets and waistline. Finding no weapons, he unclipped his handcuffs. The cold steel clamped down harshly on her wrists. He ratcheted them tight, too tight, pinching the nerves. Officer, the cuffs are excessively tight, Sarah stated objectively, documenting the interaction in her mental log. You are cutting off my circulation. Maybe you should have thought about that before driving a suspected stolen vehicle into my town. Holloway sneered, leaning in close to her ear. He smelled of cheap cologne and stale spearmint gum. You people always have a smart mouth. Think you know the law better than us. I haven't broken any laws, Sarah replied, turning her head slightly to catch his eye. You pulled me over without cause. You are detaining me without reasonable suspicion. This is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." Mitchell laughed nervously. Stepping back. "Listen to her. Greg, we got a regular street lawyer here." "Yeah, they all watch a few TV shows and think they passed the bar," Holloway said. He grabbed her by the bicep, his fingers digging into her flesh, and hauled her toward the back of the cruiser. He practically threw her into the back seat, pushing her head down roughly so she wouldn't hit the roof, a courtesy that felt more like an assault. The door slammed shut, sealing Sarah inside the heavy, suffocating, plastic-molded back seat of the patrol car. There were no door handles on the inside. The thick plexiglass partition separated her from the front. The air conditioning wasn't running in the back, and the afternoon sun was turning the cruiser into an oven. Through the window, she watched Mitchell begin tearing through her Explorer. He didn't ask for consent to search. He didn't have a warrant. He just started ripping open her cardboard boxes. He pulled out her neatly folded clothes, tossing them onto the dusty seats. He opened a box containing her framed commendations and degrees, but didn't bother to read them. Just shoved them aside, looking for contraband that didn't exist. Every illegal action, every policy violation, every constitutional breach was instantly categorized and filed away in Sarah's mind. Unlawful stop, unlawful detention, excessive force, illegal search and seizure. Holloway and Mitchell were writing their own termination letters. They just didn't know it yet. After 10 minutes of fruitlessly ransacking her vehicle, Mitchell slammed the doors of the Explorer shut and jogged back to the cruiser. He climbed into the passenger seat, looking frustrated. "Nothing," Mitchell muttered to Holloway, who was sitting in the driver's seat, typing on the mobile data terminal. "Just clothes, books, some kitchen stuff. No drugs, no weapons." "What about the registration?" Holloway asked. "Didn't check," Mitchell admitted, shrugging. "Doesn't matter. She's got an attitude. Let's take her in for failure to identify and resisting." "She gave us her ID." "Todd." Holloway sighed, though he didn't seem particularly deterred. "We'll run her for warrants. If she's clean, we'll hit her with disorderly conduct and obstructing a police investigation. Let her sit in holding for a few hours. That usually takes the fight out of them." Holloway put the car in drive as they pulled away, leaving her unlocked SUV sitting vulnerable on the shoulder of the highway. Holloway glanced at Sarah through the rearview mirror. "Enjoy the ride." "Sarah," he mocked. "Oakhaven PD has a really nice bed and breakfast waiting for you." Sarah leaned back against the hard plastic seat. The cuffs were digging into her wrists with every bump in the road, sending shooting pains up her forearms. But her face remained a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. "I'm sure the accommodations will be very revealing," Sarah said quietly. Holloway turned up the radio to drown her out. He drove deliberately fast, taking corners sharply, knowing that without a seatbelt which he had conveniently forgotten to fasten around her, she would slide helplessly across the slippery plastic bench. She braced herself as best she could with her cuffed hands, her mind moving 10 steps ahead. She wasn't just Sarah Jenkins, the victim anymore. She was Chief Jenkins, and she was going to tear this department down to the studs. The Oakhaven Police Precinct was a brick building constructed in the late 1970s. It smelled precisely how Sarah expected it, to an institutional blend of heavy floor wax, stale coffee, and the faint, metallic scent of nervous sweat. Holloway dragged her out of the cruiser by her upper arm, parading her through the back entrance and into the bustling booking area. Several officers were milling around, typing at terminals or drinking coffee. A few of them glanced up as Holloway brought her in, but none of them looked surprised. This was clearly a regular occurrence. The normalization of the abuse was almost worse than the abuse itself. It meant the culture was entirely toxic. "Look what the cat dragged in," called out a portly officer leaning against a filing cabinet. "Caught a live one on Route 114. Holloway bragged, pushing Sarah toward the booking desk. Thought she could bring her Chicago attitude into our jurisdiction." Behind the elevated desk sat Sergeant Miller, an older man with a graying mustache and tired eyes. He looked down at Sarah over the rim of his reading glasses. He didn't look malicious, just profoundly apathetic, a man who was counting the days until his pension kicked in and had long ago stopped caring about the integrity of his badge. "Name?" Miller asked, pulling a blank intake form toward him. "Sarah Jenkins," she said clearly. "Charge?" Miller asked, looking at Holloway. "Disorderly conduct, obstruction, and resisting." Holloway rattled off easily. It was a practiced lie. She was combative during a routine traffic stop. Suspected stolen vehicle. "The vehicle is registered in my name," Sarah interjected calmly. Officer Mitchell failed to check the registration in the glove box, though I explicitly informed him of its location. "Furthermore, there is dash cam footage of the stop. I urge you to preserve it." "Sergeant," Holloway scoffed, slamming his hand on the desk. "Listen to her giving orders. You don't tell us what to do. Lady, you're a suspect in custody." Sergeant Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "Just process her. Greg, put her in cell 3. Let her cool off." Holloway yanked her away from the desk. He guided her down a cinder-block hallway to the holding area. Cell 3 was a 10 by 10 concrete box with a heavy steel door, a metal toilet, and a concrete bench. It was freezing cold. Holloway unlatched her handcuffs, pushing her into the cell so hard she stumbled forward. Before she could turn around, the heavy steel door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clack. "We'll come check on you in a few hours." "Sarah," Holloway laughed through the small barred window in the door. "Maybe by then you'll remember how to say, 'Yes, sir,' and 'No, sir.'" His footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading away until Sarah was left in total silence. She stood in the center of the cell, rubbing her raw, red wrists to restore the circulation. She took a deep breath, inhaling the stale, bleach-scented air. She didn't cry. She wasn't scared. The primary emotion coursing through her veins was a cold, searing focus. She walked over to the concrete bench and sat down. She needed to wait just long enough to ensure they filed the false police report. The moment Holloway submitted that paperwork, his fate was sealed. Filing a false report was a felony. It was the nail in the coffin she needed to not just fire him, but to put him behind bars. An hour passed, then 2. The cold seeped into her bones. But she remained perfectly still, running through the personnel files she had memorized over the past month. Holloway had 6 excessive force complaints. Mitchell had 3. Sergeant Miller had a history of turning a blind eye. Finally, a young female deputy walked past the cell, doing a routine check. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice echoing off the concrete. The deputy paused, looking through the window. "What? I've been in here for over 2 hours. I haven't been read my Miranda rights. I haven't been formally booked. And I haven't been offered my phone call. I am requesting my phone call now." The deputy hesitated. She looked young, maybe fresh out of the academy. I'll have to ask Sergeant Miller." "Don't ask him. Tell him," Sarah said, her tone suddenly shifting from the polite citizen to the commanding officer. "By state law, I am entitled to a phone call within 2 hours of detention. If you deny me this right, you are personally liable for the civil rights violation. Do you understand?" The young deputy blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sheer authority radiating from the woman in the faded hoodie. I'll get the phone." 5 minutes later, the cell door unlocked. Sergeant Miller stood there, holding a cordless landline phone, looking deeply annoyed. "Make it quick," Miller grunted, handing her the receiver. And no long distance. Sarah took the phone. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call a bail bondsman. She dialed a direct, private cell phone number she had memorized 3 weeks ago. It rang twice. Richard Sterling. The deep, polished voice of the mayor answered. "Richard, it's Sarah Jenkins," she said smoothly, keeping her eyes locked on Sergeant Miller. "Sarah, I wasn't expecting to hear from you until Sunday." The mayor sounded delighted. "Are you in town yet? How was the drive?" "The drive was fine. I'm in town," Sarah replied, her voice echoing slightly in the bare cell. "In fact, I'm currently standing inside cell block 3 at the Oak Haven Police Precinct." There was a dead, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, you're where?" Mayor Sterling asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "Cell 3, Sarah repeated calmly. "2 of your officers, Holloway and Mitchell, pulled me over, illegally searched my vehicle, assaulted me, and arrested me on fabricated charges of disorderly conduct. I thought you'd want to know, seeing as I'm supposed to be running this department on Monday." Sergeant Miller's face went completely pale. His jaw dropped slightly as he listened to her side of the conversation. "I am on my way," Mayor Sterling said, his voice trembling with sheer outrage. "Do not let anyone touch you. I will be there in 5 minutes." "Take your time, Richard," Sarah said, a small, terrifying smile finally touching her lips. "I'm not going anywhere." She hung up the phone and held it out to Sergeant Miller, whose hands were suddenly shaking. Who was that?" Miller stammered. "That was the mayor," Sarah said, stepping out of the cell and casually adjusting the sleeves of her hoodie. "And if I were you, Sergeant, I'd start looking for a very good union representative." Sergeant Miller stood paralyzed behind the booking desk, the cordless phone dangling loosely from his trembling fingers. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor in its wake. He looked at Sarah, then down at the phone, then back to Sarah, his brain desperately trying to reject the reality of the situation. You're lying," Miller croaked, though the utter lack of conviction in his voice betrayed his terror. "You're a vagrant. Greg said you were driving a stolen—" "Sergeant," Sarah interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. "I strongly suggest you stop talking. Every word you say right now is being mentally recorded by your new commanding officer. I recommend you use this time to gather your thoughts and perhaps reflect on your retirement plans." Miller swallowed hard. He scrambled for his shoulder mic. "Holloway, Mitchell, return to the booking desk. Right now. Code 3. Within 60 seconds, the heavy double doors leading to the break room swung open. Officer Greg Holloway strolled in, a fresh, steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a half-eaten donut in the other. Officer Todd Mitchell trailed close behind, laughing at a joke Holloway had just made. They looked entirely unbothered, the picture of men who believed they were utterly untouchable in their little fiefdom. "What's the fire?" Sarge Holloway asked, taking a leisurely sip of his coffee. He glanced over and saw Sarah standing in the hallway outside the holding cells, leaning casually against the cinder-block wall, his brow furrowed in irritation. "Hey, who let the suspect out of the box? I told you to leave her in there to cool off." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but before a single syllable could escape, the main entrance doors of the precinct were violently thrown open. The heavy glass slammed against the rubber doorstops with a deafening crack. In strode Mayor Richard Sterling. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that practically radiated authority. Flanking him was Rowan Pendleton, the notoriously ruthless city attorney, clutching a thick leather briefcase. The precinct went dead silent. The low murmur of police radios suddenly seemed deafening. Officers at their desks froze, hands hovering over keyboards. Mayor Sterling didn't look at the desk sergeant. He didn't look at Mitchell. His eyes locked onto Holloway, and the absolute fury burning in his gaze made the arrogant patrolman take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Mayor," Holloway stammered, quickly setting his coffee down on a nearby filing cabinet. "We weren't expecting you. Is there a problem?" Sterling ignored him completely. He marched straight past the booking desk and approached Sarah. His expression softened from rage to profound apology in a fraction of a second. "Sarah," the mayor said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Are you injured? Did they hurt you?" "I have some bruising on my wrists from excessively tight handcuffs, and my shoulders are sore from being slammed against my vehicle." Sarah replied calmly, loud enough for every officer in the room to hear. "But I am otherwise unharmed, Richard." Holloway blinked, his brain misfiring. "Richard, look, Mr. Mayor, I don't know how this woman conned you, but she's a combative suspect. We brought her in for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. She's completely uncooperative. Rowan Pendleton." The city attorney let out a short, humorless laugh. He unclasped his briefcase, pulled out a thick file folder, and slammed it down onto the booking desk right in front of Sergeant Miller. "Officer Holloway," Pendleton said, his voice dripping with legal venom. "Do you have any idea who you currently have detained?" "A suspect," Holloway insisted, his voice rising defensively, though a flicker of genuine panic was finally beginning to show in his eyes. "A suspect from Chicago who came through our town looking for trouble." Mayor Sterling turned slowly to face Holloway. "You arrogant, incompetent fool," Sterling hissed. "This woman isn't a suspect. This is Captain Sarah Jenkins, formerly of the Chicago Police Department, and as of 0800 hours this coming Monday. She is the new Chief of Police for the city of Oak Haven." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum. Holloway's face went through a rapid, devastating sequence of emotions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, a sick, hollow dread. The donut he had been holding slipped from his fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a soft thud. Mitchell let out a choked gasp, taking 3 rapid steps away from Holloway, as if his partner had suddenly caught a highly contagious, fatal disease. Chief of Police," Holloway whispered, the blood completely leaving his face. No, that's impossible. The new chief isn't supposed to be here until next week." She was driving a beat-up Ford, my personal vehicle, which you illegally searched without a warrant, probable cause, or my consent. Sarah stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the man who had assaulted her an hour prior. The casual demeanor was gone. She was now embodying the full weight of her office. "You failed to articulate reasonable suspicion for the traffic stop. You utilized excessive force. You denied me my Miranda warnings, and you unlawfully detained me." It was a misunderstanding," Holloway stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture, his previous swagger entirely evaporated. "A routine traffic stop that escalated. We were just doing our jobs. Chief." Your job is to uphold the law. Officer Holloway, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a register of pure ice. Not to invent it when your ego is bruised. Sergeant Miller. Miller jumped as if he had been shocked with a defibrillator. Yes, ma'am, Chief. Collect Officer Holloway and Officer Mitchell's badges and duty weapons, Sarah ordered. Immediately. The dismantling of Greg Holloway's career did not happen in a quiet back room. Sarah ensured it happened right there, in the center of the precinct, under the harsh fluorescent lights, in front of the very officers he had previously bragged to. Holloway's hands were shaking as he unbuckled his heavy leather duty belt. He placed his Glock 19 on the booking desk with a heavy clatter, followed by his silver badge. Mitchell did the same, his eyes welling up with tears of sheer panic. Chief Jenkins, please, Mitchell pleaded, his voice cracking. I just followed his lead. He was the senior officer. I told him we didn't find anything in the car. I didn't want to bring you in. You stood by while your partner committed battery and violated a citizen's constitutional rights under color of law, Sarah replied, not sparing him an ounce of sympathy. The badge requires courage. Officer Mitchell, courage you clearly lack. You are both suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation. Internal affairs, Holloway scoffed nervously, trying to scrape together the last remnants of his bravado. Come on, a suspension? Fine, but I haven't even filed the paperwork yet. We can just wipe the slate clean, no arrest, no report. You walk away, we take the suspension. We call it even. Sarah paused. She tilted her head slightly, studying Holloway like a scientist observing a particularly dim-witted insect under a microscope. Is that right? Sergeant Miller, Sarah asked, turning to the desk sergeant. Did Officer Holloway fail to file the arrest report? Miller looked down at his computer screen. He typed furiously for a few seconds. The click-clack of the keyboard echoed in the silent room. He swallowed hard. No, Chief, Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. Officer Holloway submitted the preliminary arrest report into the LERMS database 20 minutes ago. It's digitally signed. Holloway's eyes widened in sheer terror. Miller, delete it! Delete it right now! He can't delete it. Greg, City Attorney Pendleton interjected, a shark-like smile spreading across his face. The system automatically backs up to the county server the moment a signature is applied. It's locked. The ink, digitally speaking, is dry. Sarah stepped up to the booking desk and turned the monitor so she could read the screen. She scanned the narrative Holloway had typed out. Let's see, Sarah read aloud, her voice ringing clear. Suspect became highly agitated and verbally abusive upon approach. Suspect reached aggressively toward the passenger side of the vehicle, ignoring verbal commands to stop. Suspect actively physically resisted being placed into handcuffs, requiring a physical takedown by myself and Officer Mitchell. Sarah looked back at Holloway. This is a work of fiction, officer. It's just standard boilerplate, Holloway pleaded, his face now flushed red with panic. Everybody writes it like that to cover the use of force. It's just a report. It is a falsified public record. Sarah corrected him, her voice unwavering. Under state law, filing a false police report regarding a felony or serious misdemeanor is a Class 4 felony. Furthermore, you conspired to deprive me of my civil rights. That is a federal offense under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Deprivation of Rights, under color of law. Holloway stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the cinder block wall. You can't be serious, You're going to ruin my life over a traffic stop. You ruined your own life. Greg, Sarah said quietly. You just finally picked a victim who could fight back. Sarah turned to Mayor Sterling. Richard, I want the state attorney's office contacted immediately. Specifically, Catherine DuPont. I know she handles public corruption cases. And get me Special Agent Thomas Riley at the local FBI field office. I want a federal civil rights probe opened into this precinct by tomorrow morning. Consider it done, Chief, the mayor said, pulling out his cell phone. Wait, Mitchell cried out, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the booking desk. I'll testify, I'll wear a wire. I'll tell you everything he's done. The illegal searches, the planted evidence, the cash he took from that bust on 4th Street last month. I'll give you everything. Just please, don't send me to federal prison. The entire precinct gasped. The omerta, the blue wall of silence, had just been shattered into a million pieces in front of everyone. Holloway stared at his partner, his face contorted in absolute rage. You little rat, shut your mouth! He lunged toward Mitchell, his fists raised. Hold him! Sarah barked. 4 officers, men who had previously laughed at Holloway's jokes and looked the other way at his abuses, immediately tackled him to the linoleum floor. The shifting of power was instantaneous and absolute. They recognized the new apex predator in the room, and they were desperate to prove their loyalty to her. Holloway thrashed against the floor, screaming profanities as his former friends wrenched his arms behind his back. Sarah walked over and looked down at him. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the very same pair of handcuffs Holloway had used on her just hours before she had retrieved them from Miller's desk, and tossed them to the officers holding him down. Cuff him, Sarah ordered. Read him his rights, and put him in cell 3. Let him cool off. The Monday morning when Chief Sarah Jenkins officially assumed command of the Oakhaven Police Department did not begin with a polite breakfast reception, a ceremonial swearing in, or the cutting of a ribbon. It began with the deafening roar of a coordinated federal raid. At precisely 5:45 a.m., the sleepy, affluent silence of Oakhaven was shattered by a fleet of 12 unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans rolling in a tight tactical formation down Main Street. They turned sharply into the precinct's rear parking lot, their tires screeching against the asphalt. The night shift was just wrapping up, with officers lazily sipping stale coffee and printing out minor incident reports. They had no idea that a hurricane was about to hit their front door. Special Agent Thomas Riley of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit stepped out of the lead vehicle, a no-nonsense veteran from the Boston field office. Riley had built a fearsome reputation for dismantling corrupt police unions and exposing systemic abuse. He was flanked by 36 federal agents, wearing heavy tactical vests, with FBI Evidence Response Team emblazoned across their backs in stark yellow lettering. With surgical precision, the agents breached the precinct's double doors. Federal agents, hands off your keyboards. Step away from your desks. Agent Riley's voice boomed through the bullpen, cutting through the low hum of the police scanners. Patrolmen and detectives froze in sheer panic. Coffee spilled across linoleum floors. Veteran officers who had spent their entire careers operating under a shield of absolute impunity suddenly found themselves staring down the barrels of federal authority. Agents immediately moved to secure the server rooms, unplugging computer terminals to prevent any digital files from being purged, while others locked down the armory and the evidence lockup. As the chaos of the seizure unfolded, the heavy oak door to the chief's office swung open. Sarah Jenkins stepped out into the bullpen. She was no longer wearing the faded UCLA hoodie and yoga pants that had made her a target 3 days prior. She was dressed in an immaculate, tailor-made chief's uniform. Her dark navy blues were perfectly pressed. Her duty belt shone with fresh polish, and the 4 gold stars on her collar gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, radiating an unquestionable, terrifying authority. The remaining precinct officers stared at her in stunned, breathless silence. The woman their colleagues had violently dragged out of her car, mocked, and thrown into a cold, concrete cell was now standing at the apex of their command structure, watching them with the cold, analytical gaze of an apex predator. "Good morning, Chief Jenkins," Agent Riley said loudly, ensuring every terrified officer in the room could hear him. He extended a hand. "Good morning, Agent Riley. The department is yours," Sarah replied, her voice steady and commanding as she shook his hand. "Officer Todd Mitchell is currently secured in interview room A. He has been remarkably cooperative over the weekend." That was the understatement of the century. While Greg Holloway had spent the weekend sitting in solitary confinement at the county jail, desperately waiting for a bail hearing that would never come, Todd Mitchell had been singing like a canary, terrified of facing a multi-decade federal prison sentence. Mitchell had broken down completely during a grueling 12-hour interrogation on Saturday, sweating through his clothes and weeping into a styrofoam coffee cup. Mitchell had provided an exhaustive, devastating roadmap of Oakhaven's deeply buried secrets. He didn't just give up Holloway, he gave up the entire Route 114 toll, the internal nickname a ring of 5 veteran officers used for their extortion scheme. Mitchell named names, dates, and specific mile markers. He detailed exactly how Holloway and his crew routinely targeted out-of-state drivers of color, fabricating probable cause to illegally search vehicles and seize cash under the guise of civil asset forfeiture. Cash that, miraculously, never made it into the precinct's evidence locker. Armed with Mitchell's sworn, 90-page affidavit, Agent Riley's team had spent Sunday securing no-knock federal search warrants from a judge who was absolutely furious at the breach of public trust. While the precinct was being torn apart, simultaneous raids were unfolding across the pristine, manicured suburbs of Oakhaven. At Holloway's lavish, 5-bedroom estate in the gated community of Whispering Pines, the karma was swift and absolute. Neighbors peeked through their custom blinds in shock as heavily armed federal agents battered down Holloway's custom oak front door. Holloway's wife, Cynthia, who had spent years turning a blind eye to how her husband afforded a lifestyle far exceeding a patrolman's salary, stood sobbing on the front lawn in her silk bathrobe. She watched in horror as the FBI seized her husband's luxury F-150 truck, his high-end speedboat, and began hauling boxes of financial records out of his custom-built man cave. The illusion of their untouchable suburban royalty was shattered in front of the entire neighborhood. But the most damning discovery happened at a climate-controlled storage facility 3 towns over. Mitchell had confessed that the crew kept an off-site stash house. The unit was rented under a shell corporation linked to David Palmer, Holloway's brother-in-law. When the FBI evidence response team cut the heavy brass padlock and rolled up the corrugated metal door, they found a literal treasure trove of systemic corruption. Inside a massive, heavy-duty steel gun safe, agents recovered over $140,000 in banded cash, neatly stacked in vacuum-sealed bags. They found dozens of burner cell phones used to coordinate illegal stops. But the most horrifying discovery, the evidence that elevated the case from mere theft to a horrific federal civil rights conspiracy, was a dark green military duffel bag tucked in the corner. Inside the bag were pre-packaged bags of synthetic narcotics, perfectly weighed to guarantee felony trafficking charges. Beside the drugs lay 6 drop guns. Cheap, unregistered .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolvers with their serial numbers thoroughly filed off. These were weapons specifically kept to be planted on unarmed suspects, a sickening insurance policy designed to justify lethal force and cover up murder if a traffic stop ever went completely sideways. When the news of the raids broke on Tuesday morning, the city of Oak Haven erupted. The scandal dominated the national news cycle. Mayor Richard Sterling held a massive joint press conference on the steps of City Hall, flanked by State Attorney Catherine DuPont, Agent Riley, and Chief Sarah Jenkins. The plaza was packed with hundreds of outraged citizens, civil rights advocates, and a sea of media microphones. When Sarah stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell completely silent. She looked out at the flashing cameras, projecting the absolute resolve that had defined her career. For far too long, the citizens of Oak Haven, and those simply passing through our city limits, have been subjected to an unconstitutional reign of terror by a criminal enterprise hiding behind a badge. Sarah's voice echoed across the plaza, firm and unyielding. That era ends permanently today. We are not just cleaning house, we are tearing down the foundation of this corruption. Effective immediately, I am implementing mandatory body-worn cameras that cannot be manually deactivated. We are establishing an independent, civilian-led review board with subpoena power, and every single officer in this department will undergo rigorous retraining in constitutional law. She leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes narrowing. Let me be entirely clear to anyone who wears a uniform in this city. If you break the law to enforce the law, you are not a police officer. You are a criminal. And under my command, you will be hunted down, exposed, and treated exactly like the predators you claim to protect this city from. As the crowd erupted into deafening cheers, Greg Holloway was experiencing his own personal hell. Denied bail due to the sheer volume of federal charges, the flight risk posed by his hidden cash reserves, and the severe danger he posed to the community. Holloway sat shivering in solitary confinement at the Cook County Jail. The man who had strutted through life untouchable, who had violently thrown a black woman into a freezing concrete box just for driving on his streets, was now locked in an 8x10 cell of his own. The meals were cold, the lights buzzed incessantly, and the heavy steel door slamming shut was the only sound he heard for 23 hours a day. His badge was gone. His freedom was gone. The brutal, unforgiving hammer of karma had finally fallen, and it was only the beginning of his nightmare. 14 months later, the chilling winds of late November whipped through downtown Chicago, but the atmosphere inside the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse was boiling over. The trial of former officer Greg Holloway had become a national media spectacle. News vans lined the perimeter of the plaza, their satellite dishes pointed toward the slate-gray sky, while reporters huddled in heavy wool coats, broadcasting live updates on what legal analysts were calling the most damning police corruption trial of the decade. Inside courtroom 2141, the air was thick with tension. Holloway's high-priced defense attorney, a silver-haired shark named Richard Abernathy, paced the floorboards like a caged animal. Abernathy had built a lucrative career defending the indefensible, relying on theatrical bluster and aggressive victim-blaming. But this case was an unmitigated disaster for him. For 3 grueling days, State Attorney Catherine DuPont systematically dismantled the blue wall of silence that had shielded Oak Haven for generations. The most devastating blow came from Holloway's own former partner, Todd Mitchell. taking the stand in a rumpled suit, looking 10 years older than his actual age. Mitchell had wept openly as he detailed the systematic extortion ring. Under Abernathy's brutal cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to paint Mitchell as a desperate, pathological liar, willing to say anything to avoid a federal prison cell himself. "You're telling this jury, Mr. Mitchell, that you simply stood by, helpless, while my client supposedly orchestrated an elaborate criminal enterprise out of the trunk of a patrol car." Abernathy had sneered, leaning heavily on the podium. Mitchell wiped his nose with a tissue, looking directly at the jury box. "I wasn't helpless. I was a coward. Greg told me how things worked in Oakhaven. He told me that if I wanted backup when I called for it on a dark road at 3 a.m., I needed to play along. He showed me the storage unit. He showed me the drop guns. I am guilty, Mr. Abernathy. But Greg Halloway was the architect." The silence in the courtroom following Mitchell's admission was deafening. But the true linchpin of the trial, the moment that would permanently seal Halloway's fate, arrived on the afternoon of the 4th day, when the prosecution called its star witness. "The state calls Chief Sarah Jenkins," DuPont announced, her voice ringing clear across the polished mahogany gallery. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Sarah Jenkins walked down the center aisle, her posture impeccably straight, dressed in her formal Class A dress blues. The 4 gold stars on her collar caught the recessed lighting, gleaming with absolute, unquestionable authority. She walked past the defense table without so much as a sideways glance at Halloway, who physically shrank backward in his leather chair as she passed. She took the oath, her voice steady and resonant, and sat in the witness box. DuPont walked the jury through Sarah's sterling resume, her decades of service in Chicago, and her recruitment by Mayor Richard Sterling to clean up Oakhaven. Then, they arrived at that fateful Thursday on Route 114. Sarah recounted the traffic stop with the surgical precision of a seasoned investigator. She didn't embellish. She didn't speak with anger or resentment. She simply laid out the cold, irrefutable facts. She described the lack of probable cause, the immediate escalation of hostility, the physical assault, the excessively tight handcuffs, and the refusal of her Miranda rights. Abernathy recognized that he could not rattle her with volume, so he opted for condescension during his cross-examination. "Chief Jenkins," Abernathy began, adjusting his spectacles. "You are an incredibly experienced law enforcement officer. You knew exactly how to behave during a traffic stop. Is it not possible that you, perhaps, intentionally acted elusive or uncooperative to bait my client, to create a viral incident, so you could waltz into your new job as a crusading hero?" Sarah folded her hands neatly in her lap. She looked Abernathy dead in the eye, her expression as unyielding as a granite cliff. "I placed my hands on the steering wheel. I provided my license. I spoke in a calm, even tone," Sarah replied, projecting her voice so every juror could hear her clearly. "I did not bait your client, Mr. Abernathy. I simply existed as a black woman in a vehicle he decided didn't belong in his jurisdiction. I did not have an agenda. I had a dashboard camera." At that cue, DuPont stood up. "Your Honor, the state asks for permission to publish Exhibit C to the jury, the dashcam footage from the defendant's cruiser, synchronized with the LERMS database timestamps." Judge William Crawford, a stern federal judge with a famously low tolerance for corruption, nodded. "Proceed." The large flat-screen monitors mounted across the courtroom flickered to life. The audio filled the room. The jury watched, absolutely transfixed. as the arrogant swagger of Greg Holloway was broadcast in high definition. They heard the sneer in his voice as he mocked her clothes. They gasped audibly when the video showed Holloway violently yanking Sarah from her vehicle, slamming her chest against the metal door and kicking her ankle. But DuPont didn't stop there. Beside the playing video, she projected the digital arrest report Holloway had filed from the booking desk. The jury was forced to read Holloway's typed words. Suspect became highly agitated. Suspect physically resisted requiring a takedown while simultaneously watching a video of a completely calm, entirely compliant woman being assaulted by the very man who wrote those lies. It was the most devastating side-by-side comparison in the history of the district court. Holloway buried his face in his hands. He knew it was over. There was no spin, no legal loophole, no union representative that could save him from the undeniable reality captured on tape. The jury deliberation took exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes. When the foreman stood up to read the verdict, the courtroom held its collective breath. Holloway was forced to stand. His hands shook so violently he had to grip the edge of the defense table to keep from collapsing. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman read, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. On the count of conspiracy to defraud the United States, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of filing a false federal record, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty struck Holloway like physical blows. 18 counts. 18 guilty verdicts. 2 months later, Greg Holloway stood before Judge Crawford for sentencing. He wore an oversized, bright orange county jail jumpsuit, his buzz cut grown out into a messy, graying patch of hair. He looked entirely broken. Judge Crawford peered down from the bench. His eyes narrowed in profound disgust. Mr. Holloway, you were entrusted with the immense power of the state. The judge began, his voice laced with venom. You were given a badge, a firearm, and the authority to deprive citizens of their liberty in the pursuit of justice. Instead, you used that sacred trust to terrorize the vulnerable, to line your own pockets, and to feed a pathetic, fragile ego. You are a predator who hid behind a piece of tin. You are a disgrace to the uniform, and a danger to a free society. Judge Crawford raised his wooden gavel. I sentence you to 144 months, 12 solid years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There will be no possibility of early parole. The gavel slammed down. The sound finalized the total destruction of Holloway's life. The real-world consequences extended far beyond the iron bars of USP Marion, the maximum security penitentiary where Holloway was sent, because he was convicted of felony corruption charges related directly to his official duties. The State Pension Board invoked the forfeiture clause. Every single dollar Holloway had paid into the retirement system over his 15-year career was completely wiped out. 3 weeks into his federal sentence, his wife filed for a brutal, expedited divorce, desperate to distance herself from the public humiliation and the aggressive asset freezes initiated by the civil restitution lawsuits. She left him with nothing. The man who had strutted through the streets of Oak Haven like an untouchable king, mocking citizens in holding cells, was now a bankrupt, divorced felon. He spent 23 hours a day locked in a concrete box, surrounded by the very demographics he had spent his entire career unfairly targeting. Back in Oak Haven, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Under Chief Jenkins' iron-willed, uncompromising leadership, the department was stripped down to the studs and rebuilt. The toxic culture was ripped out by its roots. Mandatory body cameras were installed, independent civilian oversight was established, and the community, once terrified of the cruisers patrolling their streets, slowly began to rebuild a bridge of trust with the officers who actually wanted to serve. Sarah Jenkins had never sought revenge. She only ever sought justice. And as she sat behind her heavy mahogany desk on a bright Tuesday morning, signing off on the latest community outreach budget, she allowed herself a small, rare smile. She had delivered exactly what she promised the mayor on that very first phone call from cell block 3. She had taken the worst of the system, dragged it kicking and screaming into the light, and burned it straight to the ground. What a satisfying end to a real-life nightmare. Chief Sarah Jenkins proved that true leadership means walking into the fire, refusing to back down, and making sure the corrupt pay the ultimate price. This story is a powerful reminder that arrogant abusers eventually cross paths with someone they can't bully, and when karma hits, it doesn't miss. From a cold holding cell to taking down an entire corrupt precinct, Chief Jenkins is the definition of a hero. If this story of absolute justice and hardcore karma made your day, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible takedown with your friends, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true stories of justice, revenge, and the triumph of the human spirit. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Let's talk about it.